Hi there, it's Larry Johnson again. Welcome back to Counter Currents. Today, I'm pleased that we're going to have the opportunity to chat with Professor Mehran Kamrava, who is a professor at the Georgetown University in Qatar, which is directly related to the Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. So please, if you like what we've done today, please subscribe and hit the like button. So, Professor, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be with you, Larry.
Okay, so let's get down to some of the initial biographical details. Now, I'm not going to make the same mistake I made with Professor Morandi, where I assumed where he was born, and I didn't know what I was talking about. So rather than assume, where were you born? Where'd you grow up?
I was born in the city of Karaj in Iran, which used to be a small town when I was born. Now it's become a posh suburb of Tehran. Then my family moved to Shiraz, and I was there until 1978. Then moved to Tehrangeles in 1978, also known as Los Angeles. And I finished high school and got my undergraduate degree there. Then went to University of Cambridge in England, got my PhD. Eventually ended up back in Los Angeles again, teaching at California State University, Northridge, where I had earlier gotten my bachelor's, and I became a professor there. And in 2007, my family and I decided to come here to Doha, where I'm joining you from, and work at Georgetown University in Qatar.
Okay. So this, I take it, was your family, I don't want to say affiliated with the Shah, but perceived as supporters of the Shah, vice supporters of the revolution, or which side of that fence did you guys fall on?
Yeah, none, quite frankly. But, revolutions are moments of black and white. And I was young during the revolution, but I remember my father saying that in the city of Shiraz, as the revolution was progressing, the former government was clamping down on some of its known figures. And so my father was transferred to the city of Zahedan, close to the Pakistani border, and he was basically demoted. And I remember he used to call it internal exile. So this was in 1977, and that's when he took leave of absence, decided not to go to work, and he decided this was the right time to move. So we immigrated to the U.S.
Was it tough getting a visa back then? I mean, obviously you may be too young to remember, but
no, actually, I do remember it somewhat vividly because we all went to the consulate and got visas. It was not nearly as difficult back then as it is now. Now it's nearly impossible, but it wasn't really that difficult. We initially got tourist visas, and then it was relatively easy to convert a tourist visa to a process whereby you would get permanent residency. And we all got permanent residency relatively quickly.
Yeah. So what I'd like to talk about today is the U.S. obsession with Iran. I mean, it borders on what I would call Trump derangement syndrome. maybe on the geopolitical side, and you're welcome to disagree with me, but the hatred and fear of Iran to me seem totally divorced from reality. Am I off base?
No, you're not, and you're absolutely right. In fact, just behind me, there's a book called Iranophobia, written by I believe, two Israeli scholars. So you're absolutely right. There's been an irrational fear of Iran. And part of the reason for that, Larry, is because the Soviet Union has collapsed, the Red Menace is gone, and Iran is a convenient replacement. And the Iranians themselves, one has to argue, do anything and everything possible to play the role of that villain for the Americans. They specialize in scoring own goals. Although there are voices of reason coming out of Tehran, voices of radicalism and kind of advocating revolution and playing into this kind of evil caricature that we see on mainstream American media and Western media, they play into it. And this is despite the fact that historically, at least for a good chunk of Iranian history, the United States was seen as a kind of benevolent counterweight to Russian and British imperialism.
Well, when you, so I think I've sort of grown up with modern revolutionary Iran. I was in college actually started working on my PhD in August of 1979 at the American University. And so when the students in Tehran took over the U.S. Embassy, I remember driving past the Iranian embassy, which at the time sat across the street from the British embassy. And, we were honking our horns and waving our fists and, oh boy, were we mad. And thinking back, nobody at the time, at least in the mainstream media, was explaining that there was perhaps a context to what was taking place that went back to the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953. And, if you will, the meddling of the United States in the internal politics of Iran. So we lost that. And so we get that initial anger. But then, as I learned in later years, the United States started arming Iran through the Israelis in part. I mean, the CIA was involved, Mossad was involved. And even though Iran had released our hostages and was starting to engage in terrorist attacks against the United States, or at least we blamed it on Iran, we started arming Iran. How did the Iranians view the United States with respect to this kind of duplicity?
Yeah, there is a love-hate relationship between Iran and the United States that has deep roots. And we have seen it magnified since 1978, 79, but it actually predates that. And so on the one hand, these two actors know that they need each other. There's a lot of synergies, strategic synergies. Iran was and can be a wonderful ally to the United States. And so the U.S. In many ways needs Iran, and Iran needs the United States. And there's that awareness. But at the same time, as you said, there's also this almost irrational animosity. It's as if two people who have been fighting for so long, they forgot why they're fighting. They just know they don't like each other. And, they just keep grasping at whatever excuse they can find to perpetuate that animosity. So there have been times when the Iranians and the Americans have really come to each other's rescue. For example, when the Taliban collapsed, Iran played a very significant role in kind of ensuring that the United States that the chaos in Afghanistan didn't explode beyond what it already had. When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, the Iranians once again, initially offered a grand bargain. The Iraqis before that, if you remember, flew many of their aircrafts to Iran, and Iran played a constructive role. And so there have been times during Clinton presidency, Secretary Madeleine Albright, made some gestures, removed some of the sanctions. So there have been these few episodes of almost flirtation, but they haven't gotten anywhere. And these longer and deeper periods of animosity have outweighed those brief interludes of warming relations between them.
Well, and in fact, I've said somewhat tongue in cheek, but that for the Iranians, particularly for the mullahs, the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, they must have seen it as proof that there is a God, because here are the Americans. They are invading Iraq, taking out Saddam Hussein, eliminating Ba'ath control of the country, removing the Sunni minority as the rulers, and installing the Shia, who are closely aligned with the people of Iran. And Iran didn't have to fire a single shot.
Exactly.
I mean, am I off base in saying that that's how it was viewed?
Absolutely. I mean, and that's just one facet of how the U.S. invasion of Iraq in the long run seriously harmed American interests. And so, and of course, the destruction of central authority in Iraq unleashed centrifugal forces with which we're still dealing. Right. ISIS is a remnant of that lack of central authority. And so what we have in Iraq, and then, of course, later as a result of the Arab Spring, this proliferation of weak states where you have these monsters like ISIS operating with impunity for at least some time, if not now. The forces that were unleashed were really harmful to the long-term interests of the United States and, of course, the millions of people who live in the region, the Iraqis, Iranians, everyone in the region.
Well, in fact, didn't Iran's been sort of in the forefront of the fight against ISIS?
Absolutely.
Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. There's been this, in many ways, if you'll allow me to just say one kind of take a digression,
Sure.
The Iran-Iraq war was a tremendous learning experience for the Iranian leadership at multiple levels. And one of the lessons of the Iran-Iraq war was that the next war will not be fought on Iranian soil. And so this is one of those strategic lessons that the Iranians learned. And they said, look, we're not going to let ISIS come into Iranian territory. And so we need to fight them abroad in Iraq and then later in Syria. And so it was really, in many ways, the Iranians and in the Americanized, the nefarious character of Qasem Soleimani, who was in many ways responsible for curtailing ISIS and for putting together military organizations, Iraqi militias that were able to eventually rein in ISIS as much as they could.
Yeah, as we develop sort of the storyline of Iran as the enemy over time, the failed rescue of the American hostages in 1980. One of my friends was a young ranger doing perimeter security when the helicopter ran into the plane out there in the desert. Later, when I went to work at State Department in the Office of Counterterrorism, one of our primary focus was on the hostages that had been taken in Beirut, and from the State Department standpoint at the time, Iran was largely blamed, even though now with additional information and years later, understand that groups like Amal that were really more like organized criminal organizations were quite active, and Iran was not necessarily pulling all the strings. However, that period of the 1980s is so confusing for Americans to understand, and I'd appreciate whatever insights you can bring to this, because on the one hand, we're dealing with Iran, the United States, and Israel through weapons and the whole Iran-Contra business. On the other hand, we're also supplying weapons and technology to Iraq, and we're encouraging both Iran and Iraq to go to war. And we're actually encouraging Iraq to attack Iran and start that war up. And and then within all that, Israel, who vows that Iran's worse than Satan, is dealing directly with Iran. So explain to me what's going on here.
I'm really glad you brought up the decade of the 1980s, because it's in many ways a pivotal decade for the life of the Islamic Republic, in the sense that it is the decade in which the Islamic Republic is consolidated. It's a very bloody decade where we have the longest war of the 20th century being fought between Iran and Iraq. And there are all these larger geostrategic developments that are occurring in and around Iran, in the Middle East and beyond, that have longer term consequences. So one of these developments, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is the lingering legacy of the Iran-Iraq war and the lessons that the Iranians drew from it. And I think the lessons of the Iran-Iraq war and the legacy of the Iran-Iraq war, which continues to be a living guide for Iranian military commanders and political leaders, is lost on policymakers and even observers of Iran outside of the country. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important. The other thing is kind of the formation of Hezbollah in Lebanon and what the Iranians did in Lebanon. The decade of the 1980s is a very tragic decade for Lebanon, when the Lebanese civil war is at full force and is really ripping the country apart. And it gives the Iranians an opportunity to step in and create or encourage the creation of a militia group that is as much of a civil society organization as it is a militia group. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And it caters to a population, the Shia, that have historically gotten the short shrift of the state services in Lebanon. And so Hezbollah is formed, and then Iran begins to view Hezbollah as part of its strategic depth and as a deterrent against a potential Israeli attack. Mm-hmm. And, we have all heard Netanyahu every other week. He says all options are on the table when it comes to Iran. Right. And of course, lately he's been acting on it. So Hezbollah becomes a really strategic asset for Iran, in the sense that it can use Hezbollah to deter the possibility of an Israeli attack on Iranian soil. So the decade of the 1980s is really critical in multiple ways. Domestically, we have political consolidation of the Islamic Republic. We have initially in the early years, we have the Cultural Revolution that in many ways Islamicizes universities. We have a reign of terror that gets rid of former revolutionary comrades and narrows down the scope of political leadership. And then the reign of terror is over. We have the beginning of the Reconstruction era. We have a major constitutional revision towards the end of the decade beginning in 1988 and 1989. We have a major leadership transition with Khomeini gone and Khamenei coming to power. So in many ways, we have the coming of age of the Islamic Republic and kind of major and highly consequential regional developments that reshape the strategic landscape of the Middle East.
Well, and just to touch on the 80s one more time, the narrative in the West is that Iran was this merciless supporter and sponsor of terrorism. It was that they hate us because of our freedom, that kind of thing, instead of putting into a context that a lot of what we saw as, let's say the bombing of the Marine barracks and the blowing up of the embassy in Beirut in 83, that with Imad Mughniya's role in that and his relationship with the government of Iran, that it was assumed that we ignored and didn't pay attention to the fact that it was the United States battleships that were killing Lebanese Muslims in the Bekaa Valley.
Exactly.
So that it wasn't just they woke up one morning and goes, man, we don't like those Americans. Let's go kill us some.
Yeah. It might be a little difficult for an American audience to grasp what the weight of U.S. power does to people who are subject to it.
Right.
It's one thing to sit in Oklahoma or Dayton, Ohio, or anywhere in the United States, even Washington, D.C. or Los Angeles, and kind of philosophically, in the abstract, imagine what it's like for any country to throw its weight around. But it's quite something else when within your soil, you have an American military presence, and you as a citizen of that country are not allowed anywhere near it, or you're seen as suspect if you kind of try and drive in that direction, and so the level of resentment might be difficult to grasp because in the United States, naturally, it's seen as service, and American military personnel are thanked for their service. But American military personnel in a place like Lebanon or in Jordan or Iraq or even in a place like Qatar or Saudi Arabia are not seen as performing a service.
Right.
They're seen as propping up political leaders that are unpopular. They are seen as symbols of America's military might. And Larry, that in American military parlance, military presence is called footprint.
Right.
So American footprint here, there, and that implies someone being stepped on. And so those people who are being stepped on, who feel the weight of the footprint, are the ones that tend to lash out, particularly in the absence of institutional venues of expression where democratic means and venues of expressing themselves are not available to them. That becomes an environment within which extremism thrives, and people become sympathetic to radical ideas and where radicalization happens. This is not to excuse by any stretch of imagination terrorist attacks on American targets. But I think, as you mentioned, we need to be mindful of the larger context within which radicals develop a message which gets a hearing and kind of strikes a receptive chord with at least certain chunks of the population.
Well, you know, I've established myself as a, quote, counterterrorism expert, and you become that if you can pronounce Imag Mugnia and properly and spell Gaddafi in two different ways, okay?
Well, I beg to differ, Larry. Your expertise go far deeper than that.
Well, thank you. But let's come back to this issue. I'd no longer really like to even use the term terrorism because it's such a politicized term and it's so divorced from reality. So, for example, Iran's the number one sponsor of terrorism in the world. But when you look at, you know, I like to do the numbers. You know, I'm not great at calculus, but I can do addition and subtraction. So I look for, show me the attacks where Iran was, you know, killing a nuclear scientist in the United States. Oh, no, that would be the CIA and the British killing nuclear scientists in Iran. My bad. But when you go out and try to count it, it turns out that the label of sponsor of terrorism is laid on Iran because of its relationship with Hamas and Hezbollah. So then I thought, you know, I keep hearing about Hamas as this terrorist organization, but I don't really recall any kind of spectacular attacks. So I found that the Israeli Foreign Ministry, of all places, they publish every single attack against the Israelis by those devilish Palestinians, going back to 2000. I was shocked to discover that the relatively small, you know, like 815 attacks in 24 years, and the biggest spike in violence was during the Second Intifada. And since then, the attacks have been largely sort of retaliation or like settler on settler violence. And it's like, and the same with Hezbollah. You know, Hezbollah is conducting military operations and raids. So it's like, I stepped back and realized, you know what? It's unfair, it's inaccurate, it's wrong to label Iran as this massive sponsor of terrorism when, in fact, I maintain the case can be made it's the United States.
I find that hard to disagree with. I completely agree with you. In fact, just this afternoon, I was doing some research and I came across a figure whereby, as you mentioned, you know, from 2007 to 2020, 7 Iranian nuclear scientists were, 6 of them were assassinated and killed, and 1, the assassination attempt was not successful. And this figure comes from none other than the US government that says Israel did it. And so, you know, I don't recall the Iranians going around and killing Israeli nuclear scientists.
Right.
You know, and so I think we need to be kind of more judicious in throwing around these terms that are highly provocative and kind of have certain connotations. And if we're going to apply standards of international law, then we shouldn't be hypocritical. We should apply them evenly, not just to those countries that we don't approve of and kind of ignore or somehow whitewash or excuse what our friends do.
Well, in fact, that was the message I think Iran's ambassador to the UN brought 2-3 weeks ago in the aftermath of the assassination of Haniyeh. That he said in there, and he said, "Look, you got this international base rules order. Either apply it, or we're going to have to act according to Article 51 to defend ourselves."
Exactly.
I mean, I'm boiling it down, but that really seemed to be his message, correct?
Absolutely. And in fact, this was the second time they were doing that. The first time they did it in recent months was back in April when Israel attacked Iran's diplomatic compound in Damascus. And one of the first things that Iran did, they went before the UN Security Council and they said, you guys need to condemn this. And of course, Israel's friends saw to it that the UN was quiet on the issue. And then that's when the Iranians went and attacked Israel. So, again and again, Iran does try and be part of the international community and play by the rules of the game that the West itself has laid. And of course, it gets rebuffed. I'm also reminded of the one time, finally, when the U.S. adopted the UN Security Council that asked for a resolution to ceasefire resolution, and then the American ambassador came out and said, "Well, it's not binding. Every other resolution is binding, but if it's Israel and America's ally, then it's not binding."
Yeah. So growing up in the United States, you may have heard of Conrad Dobler. So Conrad Dobler was this American football player. He was a lineman, and he was notorious for being a dirty player and for starting fights. And after he retired from the NFL, he'd do commercials where he'd be sitting between two people. And he'd say, "Did you hear what he said about your sister? He called your mother something that I can't repeat." And they get him, and he'd get him fighting. I maintain that's been the United States in the Middle East. We did it with Iran and Iraq to get you to kill millions. I mean, literally millions.
Yeah.
And then we did it with Saudi Arabia and Iran over Yemen.
Exactly.
Now,
and then Donald Trump, I apologize for interrupting, holds up that cardboard with all the weapons that the Saudis had purchased in the White House when Mohammed bin Salman visited. And he said, "Look at all the weapons we've sold them."
Yeah. I mean, we found some customers who are willing to buy our crap.
Exactly.
It's not only terribly useful, but talk about the implications of BRICS now. Because I see one of the manifestations of BRICS was the fact that the Russians and Chinese did intervene with both Iran and Saudi Arabia to cool down at least the war in Yemen, that proxy war. That its only purpose from the United States was to, in my view, to weaken Iran.
Absolutely. And, the BRICS is actually quite an interesting development. It appears as if in the long run, or at least in the medium run, we might be moving once again towards a bipolar world, or, kind of East versus the West, or something global South versus the global North. So on the one hand, the BRICS appears to be this kind of formation of countries, alliance of countries that don't necessarily see eye to eye with the United States, or if they do, or some of them do, they're eager to exert their independence vis-a-vis what they perceive to be American global hegemony and Western global hegemony. Then, of course, that as we know, all international trade, or most international trade, is conducted in dollars. And given the punishing sanctions that Iran is under, increasing sanctions on Russia, the competition between the US and China over high-tech science, there's been an effort to move away from the dollar and to create an economic bloc that can kind of withstand or provide an alternative, an attractive alternative. And so in my sense, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I hear a lot of Americans nowadays be dismissive of them and say,
yeah, very
"Oh,
much so. Yes, yes.
very, very much so." But you know what? I'm not sure if I would be so ready to dismiss them. It's taken the European Union decades to develop and evolve into what it is today. Give it some time and let's withhold judgment on the BRICS and SCO for the time being and see where things develop over the next decade or so.
Well, in fact, I believe that we're in a period historically comparable to what took place at the end of World War II. In fact, at the end of World War II, you had the creation of these new international institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, of course, but they're all ultimately still dominated and controlled by the traditional colonial interests, with the United States as the new arrival and the new kid on the block who's in charge. Right. That system's coming unraveled now. And I'm going to ask you, in your research, have you ever been able to have economic sanctions on a country ever worked to either force the change of the government or a change in government policy?
Well, I think to answer your question, all we need to do is to look to 90 miles south of Florida, which is Cuba, right?
I know, I was teeing this up for you.
So there is a country that has been under sanctions, and the only thing that the U.S. sanctions have done is to mire Cubans in poverty. And but they haven't changed government policy. In fact, if anything, they have hardened government policy, right. And they have resulted in kind of lack of almost any flexibility on the Cuban government to loosen up or to engage in any sort of meaningful political liberalization. And this is what we see in a place like Iran, in a place like Russia. So, the only argument that you can make where you say sanctions worked, if you stretch your analysis a bit, would be South Africa. And one can make a very credible argument that really it wasn't the sanctions, but it was elite divisions within the South African body politic,
right,
that resulted in negotiations between the Afrikaners and the African National Congress. And so in many ways, if you look at historically, sanctions have been failures in terms of what their ultimate objective is. And their only real consequence has been, in many ways, to disempower the middle classes, which is ironic, because when you disempower the middle classes, you only empower those already in power, and you enable them to really maintain power in a much easier manner.
Yeah, in fact, I saw that firsthand. I lived in Argentina in 1984 during a period of hyperinflation and the impoverishment of the middle class. I mean, people who were like upper middle class were, I mean, it was horrific what it did to their incomes, to their families. I had one close friend who he used to provide all the pastries for Aerolíneas Argentina, the Argentine airline. So he was providing the pastries that people would eat on board the planes. And he had a bakery. He would be buying a brand new truck every year. I went back, I saw him in 2002. So this is like 20 years later. He had remarried. He was driving a 12-year-old Fiat. He was living in a 3-bedroom house with 3 kids and a wife, and there was a hole in the bathroom wall. I went, it was literally outside. It did that to him. So just to emphasize what you're talking about, it's real. It affects people.
Absolutely. And so if the intent of the sanctions is to make people poor, then yeah, they succeed. But revolutions are not brought on by people who are worried about their next paycheck or their next meal. Yeah. Revolutions are brought about by the middle classes who have a little bit and want more. And so if you want to see political change initiated from below, you empower civil society organizations, and the way you do that is you empower the middle classes. You enable them to get cultural diffusion, to travel abroad, to get money transfers. You don't cut them off from the world banking system. There's millions of Iranians outside. Let these millions of Iranians send money back home. It's not the government that's going to get wealthy because of it. It's people who can then travel abroad, can go to university, can buy consumer goods, can go to engage in all sorts of activities that give them a sense of confidence, enable them to develop the sense of confidence to rise up against political oppression.
You know, it seems to me there's, you might want to steer a couple of your graduate students towards dissertations on the political inefficacy of sanctions. As far as, I'm not sure how much actual research and study's been done on that.
There's been a couple of books on the topic, but I'm glad you mentioned that. Actually, right now I'm supervising a team of students from Georgetown University in Qatar and Yale University who are working on sanctions, U.S. sanctions on Iran. And so hopefully within a few months, they will be able to present the results of their research.
Well, if anything, we can build a case that these sanctions always backfire. The sanctions on Japan prior to World War II, World War II. The sanctions on Russia in the aftermath of their special military operation / invasion Ukraine. A new unity with China. Exactly. The very relationship the United States spent 50 years trying to prevent, they decide to run off and get married.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Sanctions, over the last 15 years or so, policymakers in the West, and particularly in the United States, have discovered sanctions as an easy and inexpensive tool that captures a lot of publicity. Yeah. And in many ways, it's one of the worst things they could have done because, as you just mentioned, they backfire. They really undermine your own national interests when you impose them. But of course, they look good and they make you look tough, and they're popular with politicians, but they're the wrong course of action.
I had a boss when I worked at State. My boss, mentor, was a retired Marine colonel. And he had this saying, he goes, if it feels really good, it's probably wrong.
Exactly. Exactly.
That applies to the sanctions. Let me ask you about Stuxnet and go back to, and I'll put this into context. Right now, one of my acquaintances, who's an ardent Zionist, is telling me about how, boy, Israel's going to hit Iran with this vicious cyber attack, and it's going to cause them to crumble. And I went, they already did that. It was called Stuxnet. Maybe you missed it. And what we saw out of that Stuxnet attack was, instead of crippling the Iranian nuclear program, did some minor damage. They're back up and running with the centrifuges. But it appeared that it inspired Iran to say, we need our own cyber army. and they went to work on building one. Well, what are your observations on that?
No, you're absolutely right. The Iranians, as you mentioned, did suffer some breaches of their internet system, particularly early on, right around that time period where Stuxnet was pervasive. But they recouped, they rebounded, and then they, as you mentioned, they put together what they call a cyber army, and their cyber army has been active. And that's the problem. Iran is much closer today to a nuclear bomb than it was years ago. And one of the shocking things I hear coming out of Tehran is how many well-placed political figures and how many reasonable academics and policy wonks based in Tehran openly talk about, you know what, maybe we should have a nuclear bomb, because everything we do, nothing we do seems to be enough.
Right.
And so why not? And so I think, we, and I know I'm an idealist academic, but somehow we need to change the mindset of the policymakers in Washington and elsewhere and say, look, don't keep pushing these people to a nuclear bomb, towards developing a nuclear bomb. Don't keep fighting these battles and winning these small battles and losing the war, the bigger picture. Let's not lose sight of the big picture. So, if you release a malware in the Iranian internet system, if you kill a political figure here and a political figure there, it only makes them more determined to succeed in the long run. It only makes them more determined to strengthen their alliances with militia that you consider terrorist groups. So, on the one hand, we need to change the narrative, but we need to go beyond that and change the framework within which policy is made and make it far less ideological and far more aware of context and nuance and pragmatism.
No, I fully agree with you. It is, we're living in such a dangerous age, and the misinformation that's out there, and that's one of the reasons I try to do things like this, just to at least get some information out there where people can go back and see it and watch it and listen, and perhaps learn and say, oh, maybe it's not the black and white issue that I was told it was. I want to ask you about relations, the Sunni Shia split, but I want to do it in the context of terrorism. So another former mentor, now dead, W. Patrick Lang. Pat was he was the chief of the Middle East division at the Defense Intelligence Agency, but he also hand carried intelligence to Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, because the Iraqis stopped. They didn't want to deal with the CIA anymore. They didn't trust them, so they deal with Pat. And during one of his trips into Baghdad, he was aware that Abu Ibrahim, a much sought after terrorist bomber, was living, the way the West portrayed it, he was living and being protected by the Iraqis. And so Pat asked his Iraqi generals that he was meeting with about it. They said, we'll take you to see him. Well, he was being held in a guarded house. Now, you say, okay, so what does this have to do with Iran? Well, one of the popular memes that's in U.S. intelligence is that Iran is a big sponsor of Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda members are allowed to, I guess, live it up in Tehran. So would you care to both shed light on that, but also talk about this? Is there really a significant division now between Shia and Sunni, or Shia and Sunni, or are they also finding ways to come together and bridge theological differences?
Yeah, before I mention that, before I answer that, let me, in support of what you just said, Qatar is often accused of sponsoring Hamas and housing Hamas leaders. Ismail Haniyeh was here.
Right, right,
Khalid
right.
Mashal was here. And, what was interesting was, as you mentioned, these guys were under close scrutiny. They are and were and continue to be very closely watched. And so, what's interesting is here we have the U.S., one of the one of the biggest U.S. Bases
Yeah,
anywhere in the world, a few kilometers from where I'm sitting, just south of here. And so, Americans have eyes and ears everywhere, and these guys were under close scrutiny. And it's not as if they were living it up or
right.
they are living it up. But the narrative out there is that, oh yeah, Qatar sponsors Hamas, and Hamas is living it up in Qatar and in Doha and that. So
Yeah,
that's like the experience you heard about in Baghdad. In terms of Sunni Shia, uh, you know, uh, one of the interesting things we see is that uh, there are theological differences that ripple down into identity issues. So you're Sunni, you're Shia, and there are, in both Iran and in Arab countries, there are individuals who might be called identity entrepreneurs. Imagine these televangelists, for example,
yeah,
that go and they kind of whip up popular sentiments by demonizing the other and talking about historical episodes or theological issues that separate the two or demonize the others. And there's that. And then, of course, all of this is being done within a larger international context, which loves this kind of simple black and white dichotomy, the Shia and the Sunni and this and that. But let me just give you a couple of examples that complicate the issue.
sure.
Iran is a Shia majority state, and just north of Iran, we have another Shia majority state, Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan has fought many wars with its Christian neighbor, Armenia. And Iran, which is Shia, supports not Shia Azerbaijan, but supports Christian Armenia.
Right. Yeah,
And Iran, which is Shia nowadays, supports Hamas, which is Sunni,
right.
not Shia. And you know what? A few years ago, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, the two did not see eye to eye. They were at loggerheads, and there was a lot of tension between Iran and Hamas over Iran's support for Bashar Assad. And so what conclusion can we make? What does that tell us about Shia Sunni factor? The conclusion that I draw is that strategic considerations outweigh theological differences. And theological differences are magnified when and if, only if, they serve strategic interests.
Sure.
So when Iran wants to express solidarity with the downtrodden in Lebanon, it talks about Shia alliance. But when it wants to counter Israel, it talks with Hamas, and it kind of forgets the sectarian narrative and emphasizes the strategic interest, or the same thing in relation to Azerbaijan and Armenia. So while Shia Sunni differences exist and they can be magnified by individuals or in particular instances, they really are secondary to much more immediate strategic considerations that guide foreign policy of states.
Well, in fact, yeah, I think it would appear that let's call it the growing threat from Israel. Because I got to admit, for years, I would have considered myself, quote, a supporter of Israel. And I bought into the narrative lie that those damn Palestinians, they can't take a good deal when they see one. They're always just walking away from it. And then I learned that, Israel early on in the days of Hamas formation made a point of funding Hamas for the specific reason of creating this division between Hamas and Fatah and the PLO as a way to sow internal dissension to sabotage the process. And over and over and over, because Israel had zero interest in an actual peace agreement that would have recognized Palestinian territory. And so we jump ahead now. I was interviewing Zainab Safar, a Lebanese journalist, and I asked her about the Sunni Shia split, and she just said, no, so whatever used to, there are differences just like between Catholics and Protestants. They fought wars over those. But when it's the attack upon, quote, Christianity, it brings the Christians together. And I think that's what we're seeing now. In a way, it's a Zionist attack on Islam. And it's at least has now united, strange bedfellows. Because speak about the importance of the fact that Saudi Arabia and Iran now are no longer at each other's throats.
Exactly. Before I do that, you said now what we're seeing is a Zionist attack on Islam. You're absolutely right. Actually, it goes beyond that. What we're seeing is an attack on humanity.
Yeah.
And kind of, what is happening is just inexplicable. And even more inexplicable is the silence that we see out of capitals, out of Bonn and Washington and London and elsewhere. But in terms of Iran-Saudi rapprochement, these are two middle powers. These are two states that view themselves at a global level, kind of in the middle rank, but at the regional level, they see each other, they see themselves as superpowers. And so naturally, they have found each other on different sides, and because Iran's now has a revolutionary state, and there's the conservative Saudi monarchy, and then you add the sectarian element to it, you add the Iran-Iraq war. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait gave tens of billions of dollars to Iraq in its invasion of Iran. And so there's a lot of bad blood.
Yeah.
But then there's also kind of this awareness that if we stop arguing and if we stop tensions, we can divert a lot of our resources towards other goals, like domestic development. And so one of the interesting things we see in Saudi Arabia, beginning with around 2021, is kind of a much more inward focus. After Ben Salman came to power in 2015, he engaged in a number of misadventures that turned out to be quite costly. The killing of Khashoggi, the invasion of Yemen, the kind of really nonsensical tensions with Canada, because the Canadian foreign minister said Saudi Arabia doesn't observe human rights. There was just a lot of misadventures, the blockade of Qatar and this childish proposal to dig a canal between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and kind of turn the Qatari peninsula into an island. Then Mohammed bin Salman, once Donald Trump left office and he didn't have that kind of security blanket or that powerful patron, he decided that it's time to reduce these international tensions, to stop all of these misadventures in places like Yemen, and to have reconciliation with Qatar, and to have a ceasefire with Yemen and a rapprochement with Iran, and to instead focus on delivering the promises of Vision 2030. And this Vision 2030 is supposed to turn Saudi Arabia into the South Korea of the Middle East, into the Singapore or Japan of the Middle East. And so that's what has resulted, or at least that's one of the main reasons why we have a reduction of tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and we kind of see an end to Saudi misadventures.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on more than an hour now, but I want to end with the one most pressing issue. What's Iran going to do? Or will Iran act or not act? Because, I'll tell you right now, the intelligence community in the West and sort of the general view of the policymakers is Iran's chickened out. They're not going to do it. They're a little yappy dog, lots of bark, no bite. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or do you think the West is making a gross underestimation about what Iran's going to do?
That's a gross miscalculation of what Iran is going to do or wants to do. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. First and foremost, if I were Israeli, every night I'd go to bed worried that there might be a missile attack at some point. So, contrary to the narrative that's out there, actually, in many ways, the Iranians are winning the psychological warfare by kind of keeping everybody guessing. Mm-hmm. And so on the one, that's important. Then there's also a couple of other things to keep in mind. Iranians are famous or infamous for playing the long game. And,
yes.
And this is part of what Khamenei calls strategic patience. And so, they play the long game. And so I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, yeah, look at them, they chicken out. This is kind of an oversimplification of what I think to be a much more complicated game of nerves and kind of calculations that they're playing. And what we saw in Iran's attack on Israel in April was that they were sending a very deliberate and a very calculated strategic message, which I think was received by Israeli military commanders. It wasn't the abject failure that the media made it out to be. It was actually quite a clever kind of, they told everybody, they sent a number of dummy missiles, they sent some of their slowest drones. They just wanted to say, look, we're capable of doing this. And they actually hit some of their military targets. Right. It wasn't 90% or 99%. Later, the estimate was revised to 85%. And so I think they knew full well what they were doing. And, we have seen since then, we've seen Hezbollah release footage of drone footage of Israeli military and intelligence sites. And there are unconfirmed reports that a drone was seen hovering over Netanyahu's residence. Right. So, yeah. I wouldn't necessarily discount and kind of be dismissive. And the last piece that I'll mention, Larry, is that, one of the arguments we hear in Iran is the Israelis killed 2 people and they were not Iranians. They were guests, and it was an embarrassment. But they killed Haniyeh and his bodyguard. And so, how do you engage in a proportionate response that doesn't play into Netanyahu's hand of a major conflagration and escalation of the war, but sends a message. And so if we look at it from that perspective, I think the final chapter of this conflict has not been written. I think
Right.
it's some ways off still.
Well, in fact, I would say that even no matter what Iran does, no matter how limited, how constrained, how targeted, Netanyahu, if he's still in office, is going to use it as justification to strike Iran. But the thing that's changed, in my view, and I'd welcome your insights on this, is the military relationship with Russia and with China, but particularly with Russia in terms of Russia's ability to provide S-400 air defense systems, which can shoot down ballistic missiles, electronic warfare capabilities, which can disrupt inbound missiles. The combination of those two have actually really put Iran in a position now that it's not just hanging out there completely exposed. It's got some protection.
You're absolutely right. It's one thing to beat up on Hamas and defenseless civilian population in Gaza. It's something quite different to take on Hezbollah and especially Iran.
Yeah.
And I think Israeli military commanders are aware of it. And so, although Netanyahu engages in these sorts of attacks in order to save his or prolong his political career, I think there are saner heads in Israel. And that's why I think we haven't seen an Israeli invasion of Lebanon, because they've realized that Hezbollah is no pushover,
right,
and it's not Hamas. Never mind Iran, but even just Hezbollah.
Now, see, you proved my point today. I said we're going to go about an hour, but if it's a really good conversation, time goes by and you go, my God, it's been an hour and 10 minutes. So, hey, Professor, listen, I want to thank you so much for doing this. We'll do it again sometime. Do you have any final comments or remarks?
No, I just want to thank you for a wonderful and very rewarding conversation, and maybe make a request. My name is Mehran. Just call me Mehran.
Okay, Mehran, will do.
I appreciate Professor label, but it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And so, folks, this concludes another episode of Counter Currents. Hit the like button. Please subscribe. And I thank Professor Mehran for coming on. Or Mehran, we'll just go with the first name. We're friends. Hope to have coffee together sometime soon.
I look forward to it.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.